Bridge Toll, California customer service number.
Highway miles to the gallon, Ford Focus.
Thailand cave rescue operation.
What is Schema F?
Best wine bars in San Carlos, California.
Best Western hotels.
How old is Ronaldo?
What happened with Big Brother?
What's a good engagement?
How long before a wedding should I send out
How many
save
games
the dates?
are in the first series
Use
of the
IMAP
NBA
to
playoffs?
check Gmail on other email clients. Identify fonts from
Where to
an
find
We were
the
4
best
years
Bryant
in
stuff.
college.
habit burgers.
Welcome to Content Strategy Week on the Voices of Search podcast. This week, we're going to publish an episode every day talking about what you need to know to kick your content into high gear. Joining us for Content Strategy Week is Cassie Dell, who is a senior client success manager at Searchmetrics, which is an SEO and content marketing platform that helps enterprise scale businesses monitor their online presence and make data-driven decisions. And in addition to being our guest today, Searchmetrics is also the presenting sponsor of the Voices of Search podcast. And so far this week, Cassie and I have discussed simplifying your keyword research, understanding whether you should be building trending or evergreen content, figuring out the intent for a given topic that you're targeting. And yesterday we talked about how to do competitive research, understanding who you're competing against and what they're doing to make sure that your content hums. Today we're going to wrap up Content Strategy Week by talking about timing and content updates. But before we get started, I want to remind you that this podcast is brought to you by the marketing team at Searchmetrics. They're a team of SEOs, content marketers, and data scientists that use a comprehensive suite of software and services to deliver data and insights that enable marketers to reach their search engine optimization and content marketing goals. So if you're looking to evaluate your historical performance, identify problem areas that are slowing your growth, or implement a foundation for sustainable success with your search marketing and content marketing efforts, visit Searchmetrics' Knowledge Hub for advanced training on SEO, conversion optimization, strategy, and more. So join some of the world's largest brands who leverage Searchmetrics' data to inform their strategic business decisions. To learn more, go to searchmetrics.com. All right, here's the last installment of Content Strategy Week with Cassie Dell from Searchmetrics. Cassie, happy Friday, and welcome to the last episode of Content Strategy Week on the Voices of Search podcast.
Hey, Ben, this week flew by. I can't believe we're at the end.
It has flown by so quickly. Turns out we've actually only been recording for 58 minutes, but don't tell everybody that we don't actually show up in the morning and record these episodes.
We'll pretend.
All right, it'll be our little secret. Don't tell everybody. Look, we've talked about a lot of content strategies, figuring out what you should write, figure out who you should target, figuring out what type of content, figure out who else is competing for it. And it's all a little bit of a zero-sum game where, you're trying to outrank your competitions. If you go up, they go down. At the end of the day, a lot of what your strategies have to do with timing. It's understanding what content you have, what assets you have, what you should update, and what you should build net new. We had the conversation about building evergreen and trending content. Now there's the idea of doing a self-assessment and figuring out how you optimize your existing content. Talk to me about the cadence and timing for your content strategy, and when should you be looking to optimize as opposed to build net new?
And I think in general, it's going to obviously depend on some of the different types. A really good example I give on the topic is outdoor sporting companies. So like REI and Dick's Sporting Goods have to follow essentially a pretty strict content calendar and seasonality to kind of plan around what seasons, what different outdoor activities peak and when they kind of lull throughout the year. And then obviously follow essentially the same way we look at seasons. So I think in general, as obviously you get to know and look at that data month over month, year over year, you get a good idea of what trends and where. But obviously just kind of marking that down and adapting your content calendar around that. So you've got a good strategy going into each year and knowing when to optimize, when you need to churn out new content around the holidays and things like that is just a really way to think ahead.
One of the important topics I want to talk to you about is content updates. Right? We talked about figuring out whether you should be building trending content or evergreen content. To me, the right answer is you do both. And you build in time in your schedule to build content that's going to be great for right now, but not great for the long term. And then you build some content that's meant to get better over time. But it's not like you just build a piece of content and you forget about it. Walk me through the timing that goes into updating your content.
Yeah. So essentially, I'll tell everybody to focus. Like it's not all that planning that goes into writing something. It's not like you write it and then just, all right, cool. We're excited to see, if it helps decide as a whole. in general, benchmark that. Keep an eye on it. In general, with content, you can tend to see within 3 to 6 months that content will rise. It'll eventually have a lull. And over time, as people start to write newer and fresher content, it'll start to fall. So pay attention to those trends. Keep an eye on when that happens. Like I said, I think it's relatively different for everybody, but I would say 6 months to a year for almost any piece of content is a pretty good update calendar. There's some topics that can get away with a little bit longer, and there's some really competitive topics that are going to need to be sooner. But don't ever abandon that content. Let it just go out and live in the wild and forget about it. Always keep an eye on when that needs to be updated. And there might be segments and verticals of the business that might need to be updated more frequently and others that can get away with a little bit longer. But the only way you can really kind of pay attention to that is looking at the data, seeing when those average rankings might start to rise, fall, or in general, just stay flat, and then acting accordingly.
When you think about your content strategy and timing, how much time do you allocate towards optimizing an existing piece of content? And what's the cadence that you go back and actually say, okay, every 3 months, I'm doing a review of existing content, every 6 months, every year? How often are you going back and checking?
I'd say look at it once a quarter is a great place to start. Like I said, there's some that we can say we can push to the next quarter and some that can push a little longer, but quarterly, take a look at content, see what needs an update. When it comes to some of that, obviously writing a new article is always going to take way more time than updating. In general, you can usually get away with, especially some content that might not have changed too much. If we're looking at a topic that didn't really have a lot of new information year over year or in the last 6 months, then realistically, you might need to change some of like the SEO tags, maybe add another sentence or two, add a bullet, a few links, and that is worthy of an update in Google's eyes. So if I'm looking at it that way and I've got 50 articles, I could probably burn through that in a month easily. So I think it's something that people tend to think is a lot more time consuming than it actually is. In general, updates is essentially fitting with the latest information.
So, we mentioned trending content, and obviously all businesses are sort of built differently. When you think about updating your content, are all businesses created alike? Should all of them follow the same cadence? Or are there specific industries that you think need to update their content more often?
Yeah, I'll definitely call out in this case, your money, your life type of websites and content, especially around really competitive topics like finance, real estate, beauty, food, things like that, where there's just so much competition. These are ones where I'd say have a much more frequent content update calendar in this case. And those types of things where they're old evergreen articles, I promise you, I've seen multiple instances of you can see a graph where they just fall off over time. Not because it's not great, just because there is newer, greater, fresher content out there. So I would definitely say in that industry, they need to pay attention and really focus on updating content more than most.
At the end of the day, your content strategy is not a one-time thing when you're starting your SEO strategies. It's a revolving door. When you're building your content machine, there is a process that goes into making it effective. And it isn't just creating that new content and leaving it be. It's creating content. It's looking at how that content stacks up against your competition. It's understanding what content's performing and optimizing it. You're constantly working and tweaking to get signals to understand what Google likes and what you can do better to amplify it. Cassie, I appreciate you coming on the show, walking us all through what your advice is for content strategy. Thanks again for being my guest.
Thanks again so much for having me. It was a great conversation all week. I appreciate it, Ben.
And that wraps up this episode, and that wraps up Content Strategy Week on the Voices of Search podcast. Thanks again to Cassie Dell, Senior Client Success Manager at Searchmetrics, for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with Cassie, you could find a link to her LinkedIn profile in our show notes, or you can visit her company's website, which is searchmetrics.com. And a special thanks to Searchmetrics for sponsoring this podcast. If you're looking to evaluate your historical performance, identify problem areas that are slowing your growth, or implement a foundation for sustainable success with your search and content marketing efforts, head over to searchmetrics.com. Just one more link in our show notes I'd like to tell you about. If you didn't have a chance to take notes while you were listening to this podcast, head over to voicesofsearch.com, where we have summaries of all of our episodes and contact information for our guests. You can also send us your topic suggestions or your SEO questions, and you can even apply to be a guest speaker on the Voices of Search podcast. Of course, you can always reach out on social media. Our handle is Voices of Search on Twitter, and my personal handle is Ben J. Shap, BenJShap. And if you haven't subscribed yet and you want a daily stream of SEO and content content marketing insights in your podcast feed. We're going to publish an episode every day during the work week. So hit the subscribe button in your podcast app and we'll be back in your feed in the next business day. All right, that's it for today. But until next time, remember, the answers are always in the data.